This is lecture number 10. In this lecture, we will be looking at the first of the final two oracles in the book of Zechariah. And you should locate yourself on slide 85. We'll be looking at slides 85 through 103. As I mentioned in the introduction to the book of Zechariah, this last section of Zechariah, these last two oracles, which are undated, and in fact do not have any specific references to the prophet Zechariah. Nonetheless, these areas are quite different in style than you find in the other part of the book. For one thing, there is a fair amount of poetry in this section, as well as some prose. But most important is that the style is highly symbolic, and it is, because of its symbolism, it engenders a great deal of interpretive options which interpreters have offered throughout the centuries as well as the modern period. It is not an easy area to interpret. In fact, excuse me, a number of people would consider these two oracles to be probably the most difficult areas of interpretation in the Old Testament. Whether that's true or not, there's no doubt that these are quite different. And they do seem to have a lot of common ground with a style of literature that came along a couple of centuries or so later, called Jewish Apocalyptic. If you will look at slide 85, there is just a very brief description of some of the primary characteristics of Jewish apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature was written by the Jews in the period of the 2 centuries before the time of Jesus. So quite a bit after the time of Zechariah himself. In fact, roughly 3 centuries after the time of Zechariah. And yet, the similarity between some of the literary characteristics of this type of literature in the later period has a lot of common ground with what you find in the book of Zechariah. So much so that many historical critical scholars think that the latter part of Zechariah was written about 200 AD rather than by Zechariah himself. That's a different kind of issue, and we may say a little bit more about that later. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case, but there's no doubt that there are some common elements between this latter part of Zechariah and this literature that will be produced later in the Jewish era. Some of the primary characteristics of Jewish apocalyptic, then, are special disclosures, special insights into what is happening in the spiritual world that are not obvious from the outside. There is a marked dualism of powers and dualism of the ages, so that the power of God and the power of evil are clearly seen as in deadly combat with each other. And in fact, there is a difference between the present age and the age to come. These seem to be very strong characteristics of apocalyptic. Apocalyptic uses a lot of symbolism. Sometimes it's animal symbolism, sometimes it's parabolic symbolism, sometimes it's numerical symbolism, but symbolism is very characteristic of apocalyptic literature. There are also cosmic disturbances of the solar system, of the stellar system, the collapse of the universe, the disintegration of the stars and the sun and the moon, those kinds of things, with a lot of attention given to the presence of angels and demons who, while invisible, are nonetheless working sort of behind the scenes in this great invisible war. And in many cases, there is a messianic figure within apocalyptic literature, some kind of champion through whom God achieves victory for his people. So while this type of literature is much later than the time of the building of the Second Temple, still in the latter chapters of Zechariah, there's the beginnings of this kind of literature that will be reaching its full flower about 200 years before the time of Jesus. If you look at slide 86, I've listed for you some of the more important works in apocalyptic literature. The roots are in special places in the Old Testament, such as these 2 passages in Zechariah, also in the book of Daniel and a few passages in Isaiah. By the time apocalyptic literature is being written in its full form, you have a number of works that begin with the term apocalypse, and you can see a number of them here. The Apocalypse of Abraham, the Apocalypse of Adam, the Apocalypse of Daniel, the Apocalypse of Elijah, and so forth. These works, which belong to the collection called the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, are works that were written under pseudonyms or in honor of these ancient people. And they provide, or at least attempt to provide, insight into the unseen world that lies behind the visible world. So, while Zechariah is not formally part of the Pseudepigrapha, it does have some common links with it, and we should at least keep that in mind as a literary genre as we begin looking at this area of Scripture. Slide 87. The first of these two oracles, and we'll be covering the first one in this lecture, is an oracle that describes judgment, salvation, war, and victory. One of the immediate differences between this oracle and what you find earlier in the book of Zechariah is that while the first section has a sense of immediacy with respect to the building of the second temple, it has direct references, for instance, to Joshua, to Zerubbabel, to the actual project of building the temple, of putting the capstone on the temple. When you get to this section beginning in chapter 9 of Zechariah, there are no more specific references like that. In fact, these two oracles at the end of Zechariah seem more applicable to a large degree to the future rather than to the present time of the rebuilding of the second temple. Each of these oracles begins with the heading Masa, which is the Hebrew word burden. In some translations, like the New International Version, this is translated as an oracle. But it is the word burden. That means it's a message that is very heavy, very intense. The genre is very much like apocalyptic, but it has a large degree of poetry, and of course, as I mentioned, a lot of imagery and symbolism. So with those kinds of things in mind at the beginning, let's take a look at the way that this oracle proceeds. It begins in the first 8 verses of chapter 9 with a judgment upon neighboring peoples, a seeming invasion as the Lord conquers all of the cities on his way to Jerusalem, working from the north toward the south. The various cities and areas that are mentioned, Hadrach, Damascus, Hamath, Tyre and Sidon, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod, all of these move from north to south if you locate them on a map. In fact, if you will go to slide 89, actually we're going to come back to slide 88 in a minute, but if you go temporarily to slide 89, you can see how this works. You can see that Hadrach is quite northerly in the area of Syria, modern Syria on the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. Hamath is on the Orontes River. You can see that Sidon and Tyre are cities that are on the coastal plain of Phoenicia, north of the Sea of Galilee, and Damascus is the capital of the area of ancient Aram. Then if you look briefly at slide 90, once you move south into the heartland of Israel, you'll see 4 cities that are all in the Philistine plain: Ashdod, Ekron, Ashkelon, and Gaza. The only Philistine city that is not mentioned is Gath, and Gath seems to have disappeared sometime in antiquity before the exile of the north. And so this invasion of God, this coming of God to Jerusalem, moves from north to south. Now, going back to slide 88. As you read this passage and you see that God is going to conquer all of these areas, he's going to take away the possessions and destroy the power of the sea. You'll notice in verse 4, Gaza will lose her king. Verse 5, Ashkelon will be deserted. Foreigners will occupy Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. In all of this process from north to south, God conquers the nations. But then there is this very surprising element in verses 7 and 8. Verse 7 says, I will take the blood from their mouths and the forbidden food from between their teeth. At first glance, this may sound a little bit puzzling, but you need to read this in the context of ancient kosher food laws from the Torah of Moses. Of course, the Israelites were forbidden to eat blood. They were obliged to very carefully bleed their animals when they were slaughtered for food. They could not eat an animal, for instance, that had not been bled properly. And furthermore, because of kosher laws, there was a lengthy list of things that they were not allowed to eat. These kosher laws were distinguishing marks of the people of God. And the interesting thing about this passage in verse 7 is that these kosher laws are now going to be implemented for the Philistines. God will take the blood from their mouths and the forbidden food from between their teeth. In other words, the Philistines will be converted. They will be embracing the dietary laws of Israel. And as such, they will become part of God's people. So it says in the last part of verse 7, those who are left will belong to our God and become leaders in Judah. Wow, that comes as quite a surprise that the Philistines, who were the perennial enemies of Israel, going all the way back to the time of the Judges and Samuel, that the Philistines will actually be included as part of the people of God. And not only included, they will become leaders in Judah. And then it says that Ekron will be like the Jebusites. Now, Ekron, of course, is one of the cities of the Philistines. The Jebusites were the original inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem before it was conquered by David. In fact, in the ancient period, it was called the city of Jebus. But when David conquered the city of the Jebusites and made Jebus his new capital, calling it Jerusalem, the city of peace, then the Jebusites were kind of incorporated into the people of Jerusalem and the people of Israel as residents. In fact, you will find that there was still a Jebusite living just to the north of Jerusalem when David bought the property on which the temple would stand. There was a man by the name of Araunah the Jebusite that sold him the threshing floor. So just as the Jebusites became incorporated into the people of Israel through the conquest of Jebus in Jerusalem, so Ekron, originally a city of the Philistines, would be incorporated into Judah and would become part of the Commonwealth of Israel. This is quite a striking prediction about the future. As we move ahead from verse 9 and forward, this invasion of the cities of Syria and Palestine is linked to the arrival of a new king to Jerusalem. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, verse 9 says. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This new king would come as a righteous, gentle king. He would be riding on a donkey. Now, the idea of the donkey is quite important because there's a very great difference in the ancient world between a donkey and a horse, and that doesn't just mean a biological difference. There's a symbolic difference. Horses were bred for war. They were used in chariots. They were used in cavalry. They were not used domestically. Donkeys, on the other hand, were decidedly domestic animals. They were used by the family to carry burdens between the well and the house or from village to village, but they were always symbols of peace, not symbols of war. The fact that the king that is coming is gentle and riding on a donkey is the idea that this king is coming in peace. And it recalls the ancient prophecy of Jacob about Judah, that Judah would tether his donkey to the vine. This goes all the way back to the last words of Jacob in Genesis 29. Then it says the implements of war would be cleansed from both the north and the south, from Ephraim and from Jerusalem. Verse 10 says, I'll take away the chariots from Ephraim. This would be a reference to the northern nation prior to the exile. And the war horses from Jerusalem, which is the capital of the south. And the battle bow will be broken. And when this new king comes, he will not only bring peace to Jerusalem, but he will proclaim peace to the nations of the world. His rule will extend from sea to sea. Probably that means from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. The river probably refers to the Euphrates River, which is typically the way that is remarked upon in Scripture, and all the way to the ends of the earth. What an incredible prophecy about the future. Then as you proceed further from verse 11 and forward, there is a description of the deliverance of Israel. And once again, the vision returns to war. God will rescue his prisoners of war, and he will empower them against the Greeks. You'll notice it says he frees his prisoners from the waterless pit, and he announces that he will restore them twice as much as before, and he will then send the people of Judah and Ephraim against the sons of Greece, the islands of the Aegean. Well, what could that mean? What an unusual prophecy. At this period of time, at least in the time of the building of the Second Temple, the region of Greece was far outside the range of vision of most people that lived in Palestine. It was a very long way off and seemingly unconnected to them. Then, in a striking theophany, God appears to defend his people, and he will rescue his people, saving his flock and restoring them with full blessings. So, he will shield them. He will march in the storms of the south. And then in verse 16 it says, God will save them on that day as the flock of his people. They'll sparkle in his land like jewels in a crown. Well, what could this mean? As we move forward, we're going to get more attention about this idea of the flock and God shepherding the flock. The bulk of chapter 10, in fact, is about this very concept. The perennial problem for the Israelites, of course, had been terrible leadership. Their kings, their priests, their prophets had often led the people astray, and the metaphor of shepherds was the typical metaphor for kings, sometimes for priests and prophets, but primarily for kings. And without good leaders, the Israelites had repeatedly fallen into idolatry and pagan spirituality. In fact, in many cases, it was the kings themselves that led the people of God into idolatry and pagan spirituality. They worshipped the Baal cult. They worshipped the fertility religions of the Canaanites. But now in chapter 10, Yahweh himself is going to become a good shepherd to the flock. Notice it says that in chapter 10 in verse 2, it says, the people wander like sheep, oppressed for lack of a shepherd. And I'm angry against these shepherds, God says. I'm angry against these bad leaders. And so I will shepherd the flock myself. I will become a good shepherd to them. And I will empower both the north and the south. I will regather the exiles from Egypt, from Assyria, from the nations, and I will multiply them and lead them, as it were, in a second Exodus. In fact, the remainder of chapter 10, all the way from chapter 10, verse 4 through verse 12, is really a description of how God would gather his people, and he would shield them, and he would bring them back from Egypt, and bring them back from Assyria, and bring them to Gilead and Lebanon. And they will pass through a sea of trouble, sort of like the Red Sea. And the surging sea will be subdued, and the depths of the Nile will be dried up, and Assyria's pride brought low, and Egypt's scepter pass away. And I will strengthen my people, and in his name they will walk, declares the Lord. So in spite of their false shepherds, in spite of the bad leadership that they had had, God himself would lead the people and gather them together. Now within this oracle, there is in verse 4 a very intriguing passage that uses 4 primary metaphors or images that all go back to the past of Israel. One is the cornerstone, one is the tent peg, one is the battle bow, and one is the ruler. The imagery of the cornerstone goes back to the oracles of Isaiah, that there would be a tested stone in Zion, a stone that would be rejected. And in Psalm 118, this idea is mentioned again. The idea of the tent peg goes back to Isaiah 22, in which Hilkiah is described as the one carrying the key to the house of David, and who opens and no one can shut, and who shuts and no one can open. He is the steward of the house of David, and he will be driven into a secure place like a tent peg. The battle bow perhaps goes back to the closing days of the life of Elisha, in which he was to take a bow and and instructed his king to shoot an arrow, and the arrow was the arrow of the Lord's victory. Now, Judah will become the arrow of the Lord's victory, the battle bow. And then every commander from Judah will be part of the royal role in which Judah plays her part in the tribes of Israel. Going all the way back to the closing words of Jacob in Genesis 49. Jacob talks about the scepter of Judah, which is a symbol of royalty. The scepter or rulership will not depart from Judah until the one comes to whom it belongs. Now this idea is raised again in this fourfold metaphor of the cornerstone, the tent peg, the battle bow, and every commander. The upshot of all this is that when the new king comes, the new king is like this in every way. He is like the cornerstone. He is like the tent peg. He is like the battle bow. He is like a ruler. He embraces all of these incredibly strong ideas of leadership in himself. And he comes in peace to rescue his people. Slide 95. Then, when you come to chapter 11, the bulk of this chapter is a movement, actually three movements, and it gives place from poetry to prose, except for this last stanza in verse 17. Once again, the focus is the flock of Israel. Israel is God's group of sheep, and the shepherds are Israel's leaders. And so, this is what Yahweh my God says, chapter 11, verse 4. Pasture the flock marked for slaughter. Their buyers slaughter them and go unpunished. And those who sell them say, Praise the Lord, I'm rich. Their own shepherds do not spare them. In other words, both from inside and outside, the people of Israel have been ravaged by bad leaders, by people who have taken advantage of them, who have exploited them. So in this first movement then, God calls upon the prophet to act out the role of a good shepherd to the flock that has been ravaged by such poor leadership. He says, verse 7, I pastured the flock marked for slaughter, particularly the oppressed of the flock. I took 2 staffs and called one favor and the other union, and I pastured the flock. In 1 month I got rid of 3 shepherds. So in his taking up the role of a good shepherd over the flock of God, the prophet's primary tools were the shepherd staves that were called favor and unity. And these were symbols of his style of leadership, his gracious care. He rescued the flock that was marked for destruction. In the process, because there were bad leaders among them, he dismissed 3 shepherds that were unworthy of the name shepherd. They were like hirelings, and they were the kind that would leave the flock in times of desperation. Then in the second movement of the narrative, the flock turns against the good shepherd, and he, in turn, abandons them. So it says, the flock detested me. This is the latter part of verse 8. The flock detested me, and I grew weary of them and said, I won't be your shepherd. Let the dying die and the perishing perish. Let those who are left eat one another's flesh. In other words, you have abandoned me, and you have rejected me, and so I am abandoning you. And so he broke his shepherd's staff called favor, and he asked for his wages, because he was now being dismissed. Well, the flock simply pays him the price of a slave for his wages. Now, in verse 13, it's called a handsome price or a lordly price, but that's a sarcasm. This is not a good price. This is a cheap price, and it's only sarcastically called a lordly price or a handsome price. This is really the price of a slave, as you will notice back in Exodus 21. And so they paid him only the price of a slave, and then he broke his shepherd's staff that was called union. After the breaking of the second staff, you have the third movement in this oracle. And in this case, the prophet is instructed to play the role of a worthless shepherd or a bad shepherd. So verse 15, Yahweh said to me, take again the equipment of a foolish shepherd. I am going to raise up a shepherd over the land who will not care for the lost. He won't seek the young. He won't heal the injured. He won't feed. He won't care for the flock. He will simply eat the meat of the choice sheep, tearing off their hooves. And then there's a curse pronounced upon this evil shepherd is the last verse in this part of the oracle. This role symbolizes what would happen to the flock after they reject the good shepherd. And, of course, the narrative ends with this curse, "Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. May his arm be completely withered and his right eye totally blinded." And then the oracle ends. Well, interpreting this oracle is not an easy thing. Over the centuries, Christians have read this in various ways. But mostly their interpretation of this oracle falls into three large categories. One is historical, and in this way the attempt is made to locate the meaning either in the history of Israel before the exile or in the history of Israel after the building of the Second Temple. We'll look at both of those in just a moment. In the futuristic approach, the approach is to locate the meaning in the life of Jesus or else at the very end of the age, the end of the world. And the third is a more spiritual or symbolic approach in which the wars are simply treated as symbolisms for the missionary spread of Christianity. So we'll take a look at each of these in one sense in just a moment. But let me say a word about them in general first of all. Those who try to locate the meaning in the history of Israel prior to the exile will go all the way back to nearly the beginning of the history of the nation in the land of Canaan. Those who try to locate it after the exile, and in fact after the building of the Second Temple, attempt to do it in the Maccabean period. Now, you may not be familiar with the Maccabean period, but this is the period in the 160s BC in which the Jews were especially oppressed by the Syrian Greeks. In fact, it is precisely because of the reference to Greece in chapter 9 and verse 13 that many historical critical scholars believe that this portion of Zechariah was written during the 160s BC at the time of the Maccabean revolt. The Syrian Greeks tried to oppress the people of Israel. They attempted to exterminate the faith of Israel and the rituals of Israel, and they established the image of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, so much so that a family of priests rose up in rebellion and fought against the Syrian Greek overlords and eventually won the independence of the Jews for a period of time, nearly a century. Now, it's certainly true enough that there are some predictions in Zechariah in this description of war that seem similar to what happened in the Maccabean period, but there's at least a couple of reasons for caution about this approach. First of all, the idea that the Philistines were converted certainly never happened. The Philistines did not become part of the people of Israel, and they did not join the Commonwealth of Israel. And furthermore, the temple was not protected. Part of this vision is that God would protect his people and protect his city and temple. And yet that does not happen. But in fact, the Syrian Greeks desecrated the temple in what Daniel will call the abomination of desolation. So at least that approach is somewhat questionable. If you look at the futuristic approach that tries to put everything to the end of the world, again, there are some problems. The Philistines, for instance, have long since disappeared. There's no way to trace the pedigree of the Philistines in the modern world. References to the dispersion of the Israelites in Assyria and Egypt seem very difficult to apply in the modern era. And so there's some questions about that. But on the other hand, the spiritual interpretation is not easy either, because it allegorizes basically the details of this vision. And allegorization, the problem is that you can almost make it apply to anything you want to, and so it's less certain. In any case, I do want to offer to you at least some details about these approaches and how they might take shape. And we'll start with a historical interpretation of this vision in the period before the exile. Those who interpret this oracle as referring to Israel prior to the exile go all the way back to the period of the Judges, in which the flock is marked for death. The people of Israel are encroached upon by the Moabites, by the Philistines, by people in the Transjordan, They go through the cycles of the period of Judges, barely hanging on to their existence until all the way into the time of Samuel, when they reach a very low ebb, and the Israelites are at the verge of collapse. But then there is a united monarchy. There is favor, and there is union. The great shepherd, who is the good shepherd, would be David. And the three shepherds that would be dismissed would be King Saul, Abner, his general, and Eshbaal, Saul's son. The breaking of favor and union would be the rupture of the monarchy under the close of the reign of Solomon, under Rehoboam and Jeroboam the first. And then the subsequent shepherds, which are evil kings, the foolish shepherd, if you will, refers to the evil kings of Israel and Judah. And the worthless shepherd, which is the last, would refer to Zedekiah, who deserted the flock. In fact, 2 Kings 25, and it's also mentioned in Jeremiah 52, and symbolized in Ezekiel chapter 12, Zedekiah actually tried to abandon the city of Jerusalem in the last days of the siege of Nebuchadnezzar II. He tried to sneak out of town, sneak through the wall. And so those who interpret this narrative in a very historical way as being entirely in the past do it in this way. On the other hand, if you interpret it in a messianic way, you will try to link it to the time of Jesus, especially because of the references to him riding, the king riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and that sort of thing. The flock marked for death, then, is the people of Israel during the Greek and Roman oppressions yet to come. Both the Greeks and the Romans very severely oppressed the Israelites, and of course the Romans conquered Palestine in 63 BC under Pompey the Great. The Good Shepherd in this case would be Christ himself, and yet he was rejected by his own flock. The dismissed shepherds, in this viewpoint, are various messianic pretenders in the first century, people that are described in some detail actually in the writings of Flavius Josephus, who was a contemporary of Jesus in the first century. People like Judas the Galilean and Theudas, both of whom are mentioned in Acts chapter 5, but others also who claimed to be messiahs, but ended up leading the people of Israel astray. Because the people of Israel abandoned Christ, he leaves them to what will eventually be their destruction under Titus Vespasian in the first Jewish revolt, and that will end with the destruction of the temple. In fact, Jesus directly talked about the destruction of the temple in his discourse on the Mount of Olives. And so those who link this vision with Christ directly try to understand the elements of the vision within the context of the Greco-Roman period and the coming of Christ. The evil shepherd in this case would be the leader of the first Jewish revolt in the mid-60s AD, Simon Bar Gioras, which ended in total disaster with the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. If we look at this oracle from the standpoint of those who embrace dispensationalism, they generally are going to read this passage as referring to the very end of the age, all the way to the time that is future to us even today, to the end of the world. The flock marked for death would refer to the persecution of the Jews in the Great Tribulation period at the end of the age. And generally, the dispensationalists will link the flock marked for death with the persecutions that are described in the book of Revelation. The Good Shepherd, of course, is Christ. He was rejected by his own flock. But the dismissed shepherds are those messianic pretenders at the end of the age. And they would link it to Jesus' words in which he said there will be many false Christs and false prophets. These would be the dismissed shepherds, who are simply pretenders. The Jews would be abandoned to the persecution of the great red dragon, who goes out to make war with the woman and with the remnant of her seed in Revelation 12, and also with the beast from the sea in Revelation 13. And the evil shepherd in this case refers to the eschatological Antichrist, the one whom John calls the Antichrist and Paul calls the man of lawlessness, and whom John describes as the beast from the sea. So as you can see in this third interpretation, everything is put into a real space-time historical context, but it's all future. Now, stepping outside then the three models of interpretation that I've offered to you, let's take a look very briefly at what we can anchor down for sure. There are two very clear links to this oracle in Isaiah with the time of Jesus. One is Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Both Matthew and John describe Jesus' entry as a fulfillment of the passage Zechariah 9 and 9. So that is a firm link with at least the time of Jesus in one aspect of this vision. The second has to do with Jesus' betrayal by Judas. John's gospel presents Jesus as the good shepherd, as you're quite well aware. In John 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. My sheep know my voice. And he also talks about false shepherds, those who would flee from the flock, who were hirelings. Matthew links the insulting wages of the good shepherd with the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas. Just as in this oracle of Zechariah, the 30 pieces of silver are paid to the shepherd when he's dismissed, so the 30 pieces of silver are paid to Judas when he betrays Christ. Finally, Matthew describes Judas' blood money as something that was used to purchase the potter's field. In the book of Zechariah, the money is thrown to the temple potter. In Matthew, Judas' blood money is also used to purchase a potter's field, the field where the potters discarded their broken vessels. And so, at least there's two links within this oracle to the New Testament. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and Jesus' betrayal by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. In addition, if you look at slide 103, there are various other possible allusions in the New Testament, but these are less certain because these are not actual quotations. These are more along the lines of parallels that can be seen, but it's a little more debatable whether they're actual direct references. There is the Good Shepherd's rejection by the flock that may, of course, be reflecting of when Christ being rejected by his own. He came unto his own, and his own did not receive him. The new king's reign of peace that's spoken of in Zechariah 9 and verse 10 certainly reflects upon the message of the angels at the birth of Jesus. Peace on earth, goodwill to men upon whom his favor rests. And the ruler from Judah who is the cornerstone certainly links up with the idea that Jesus is the cornerstone. The wars against the nations might reflect upon the visions of John in the book of Revelation. And the regathering and restoration of the scattered people of Israel may reflect upon the gospel to the nations. That seems to be implied, at least, in the opening of James and the opening of 1 Peter, where the term the diaspora, the term the scattered people of God, is used to apply to the Christian church. The conversion of Gentiles may hint at the gospel. The conversion of the Philistines may hint at the gospel to the Gentiles, because the Philistines, of all the people in Palestine, were the most Gentile because they were originally from the Aegean. And the false shepherd could possibly hint at the eschatological Antichrist. All of these ideas are possible allusions, but I think they need to be held at least with some reservation. In closing this lecture, let me just mention something about open questions. We often have open questions about passages in the Bible, just as we do with this passage in Zechariah. We ought to be clear where the Bible is clear, and, of course, the passages about Jesus coming into Jerusalem on the donkey and Judas betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, those are clear passages. But then we ought to be more reserved about unclear passages. And so it is the pathway of prudence to allow open question to exist without trying to necessarily believe we have to answer them all. Some interpreters take the position that since the Bible is infallible, that their interpretations ought to be infallible. But there's no reason for us to think in that way. It is quite possible for us to leave questions open that we may not have the answer to. And in this oracle in Zechariah, there seems to be a good case in point. With that, we close this lecture, and we will take up the final oracle of Zechariah in the next one.